Today on The Journey with Steve DeWitt.
Don't waste your masculinity. Use it for the glory of God. Use it for things that in the end matter. Here is the call to masculine initiative. If Jesus was passive, we all go to hell. For us to be saved, Jesus took the initiative, did he not?
Beyond sports, strength, and stereotypes lies the true heart of masculinity. Today on The Journey, Pastor Steve DeWitt reveals how authentic manhood finds its deepest expression not in the stadium, but at the cross. We're discovering why God calls men to lead with tender-hearted strength and Christ-like courage in every aspect of life. It's the second and final part of a message titled, What is a Man? If you missed part one, you can catch up online at thejourney.fm and on the Journey podcast. Now, here's Pastor Steve DeWitt.
A man is a biological male, human, who embraces God's design for male headship, servant leadership, and sexual fidelity and protection of women. So let's walk through it. Here we go. We begin with a man is a biological male who embraces God's design for male headship. Now, headship, I'm acknowledging this is a term not often used. It is a Bible term. It's an old term, but it is a Bible term. It is a biblical concept. So headship here is a term of strength. It is a term describing care and love and stewardship and sacrifice. What does it mean to be a man? Servant leadership. Like Jesus, men are called to serve their families, to serve their community, indeed even to serve their country. And when that service is happening in a marriage or a family, church, here comes God's blessing and God's shalom, God's flourishing comes to that home and to that church. This is our calling. And if I could just ask men, how are you doing with strong, masculine servant leadership? Real men are committed to sexual fidelity. God calls men to protect not only their own virtue, but the virtue of women. And by doing this, it actually enhances and channels sexual pleasure and desire within marriage. And finally, men, real men, give themselves for the protection of women. So, that's my definition of a man. Walk through it briefly with you. What does that look like in life then? How does that play out in the categories of life? Again, beyond the plumbing and the DNA, to recognize that manhood, real manhood through the eyes of God, is about character. And that masculine character is under assault in the day that we live in. We start with a man and his mission. Men, what is the goal of your life? What are you really trying to accomplish, to be? Having the right mission plays a huge role in being the man that God would have us to be. The mission for a man is to devote our lives to make disciples of Jesus. And in the day-to-day of life, we do this largely by living out the gospel in our marriage, and living out the gospel in our vocation, and living out the gospel in our recreation, and living out the gospel in our masculinity. What is the purpose of my masculinity, that strength of character, that bravery? What is the purpose? It is not that I might increase and everybody else decrease. It is that I might decrease and Christ might increase. And God has called Christian men to be on mission and to take that masculine strength and all that creativity and that energy and that leadership and to pour ourselves into the making of disciples, first in my family, in my home, through the church and the community, and to display the glory of Jesus in every aspect of my life. And here's the thing about being a Christian man is that our big thing, our mission flows in the stream of our passion if we're a Christian. And when we love Jesus, now the opportunity to take that strength of character that masculinity provides and to flow in the passion that is mine if I'm a Christian, you see how these channels come together. The man who says he loves Jesus, but his real passion is some of these other things, is living a kind of disjointed masculinity. But the Christian man, my passions flow with my callings. What I want to do is what God wants me to do. And to do that on mission for God's glory is a high privilege. So take the strength of character, the grit. Man, I love masculine grit. Men have a certain kind of, take all that, and flow it in the directions that godly masculinity calls us to. And in the end, we bear fruit to the glory of God, and we are living an integrated life. The non-Christian doesn't think anything that I've just said is nearly as exciting as his country club membership or the UFC fight last night. Oh, now that's really awesome. All the spiritual talk is for the women. But I'm not talking to men who don't profess to be followers of Jesus. I'm talking to men today who do. And if you are a follower of Jesus, you have said to Jesus, I love you. I love you more than anything else. And now this overarching mission is to purposefully love my wife if I'm married, to love my children if I have children, to love my church and to love my community, and to take all of that masculinity and unleash it in categories that matter forever. And I just urge you, don't waste your masculinity. Use it for the glory of God. Use it for things that in the end matter. A man and his mission. Are you on mission, men? Now this one could get me in a little trouble, but I think it needs to be talked about. Let's talk about a man and his mommy. Our culture idolizes adolescence and often perpetuates it in the young men who fail to become actual men because they ongoingly live this sort of adolescent freedom where mommy and daddy are oftentimes footing the bill and covering for them. I mean, think about a little Johnny who's still living at the house. He's an adult, but he's still in the house, and his mom still does his laundry and feeds him, and dad's paying the cell phone bill. They wonder, when is he leaving? Why would he leave? He's on the gravy train. You know, this never happened in ancient cultures. In ancient cultures, you got to a certain age and boo, off you go. You're on your own now. But today, we live, and there's so many people where little Johnny is, now they use words like this, we're just trying to be good stewards of money, and he's living in the basement and saving up. But these boys, they never grow up. Mommy just keeps coddling him, doing the laundry, taking care of his every need. And mom and dad, I just want to say, you are doing your son no favor at all by perpetuating his immaturity. There is something about paying your own way that turns boys into men. But I would say every parent of any wisdom wants their boy to grow up. Now, are there emergencies? Yes. Does life happen? Yes. Okay. But in general, little Johnny becomes big Johnny when he takes responsibility for his own life. So cut the umbilical cord and let him grow up. And you know what? He might, in doing that, find a woman and provide you with grandchildren. Did you know grandkids are God's gift to parents for kicking their kids out of the house? A man and his mommy. Let him grow up, please. A man and his marriage. Let's talk about this. And again, as you know in my story, I didn't get married till I was later in life, not because I was in my parents' basement, but I got married later in life, and for some people, this marriage is not God's call, and so we have a high view of singleness as well. But I do want to talk about a man and his marriage with these words, Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. There are no more critical, important words in the Bible for husbands than these right here. They summarize the entirety of what it means to be a godly husband. Notice the command, love your wives. So we can say this, real men, authentic manhood, loves his wife. Loves like who? And right now you're thinking about people that love badly. You know, Uncle Bob. Oh, he was terrible, right? Or my brother-in-law. Man, I love comparing myself to him. And that's what we do. We compare to a bad example because it makes us look better. But notice that Paul says this loving of our wives, he gives an example, but it's not a bad one, it's the ultimate one. As Christ loved the church. So there is the aspirational goal. We are to paradigm our loving of our wives according to the example of the way that Jesus loved and loves the church. Notice the moment of Jesus' life that is the example and gave himself up for her. What is that? It is the cross. The cross is not only where we go for our salvation, but as men, this is where we go for our example of what it means to be a husband, how to be a godly man. And Paul adds this, gave himself up for us. So it's not that I got to bleed. It's not that I got to be, literally crucified. It is that the orientation of my life in my marriage is towards a sacrificing for the needs and the joy and the good of my wife. It's a crucifixion-like giving up of ourselves. C.S. Lewis says it this way, this headship then is most fully embodied not in the husband we should all wish to be, but in him whose marriage is most like a crucifixion, whose wife receives most and gives least, is most unworthy of him, is in her own mere nature least lovable. For the church has no beauty, but what the bridegroom gives her, he does not find, but makes her lovely. And what Lewis is getting at there is that the kind of love that the husband is called to give to the wife is not a performance-based love. It is not a beauty-based love, because the church was ugly and Jesus gave himself up for her. It is a kind of agape, sacrificial giving of myself for my wife when she doesn't deserve it, that most resembles the love that Jesus has for the church. And so here we have simultaneously the most wonderful and convicting verse in all the Bible for a husband. I feel it even as I preach it. Now, I say this again as a man who got married later in life. Singleness has its own callings and blessings. But if you are married, or if you're a boy, man, hoping to be married someday, I would highly encourage you to consider that wedding day as your crucifixion, as a kind of dying to self. And guess what? Every day from that point on is a kind of dying to self. Now, you ladies don't like me talking about it this way, I know. Because to you, you're like, he's not dying, he's gaining, because he gets me. Okay, that's the honeymoon. I'm talking about the other 50 years here, okay? The day-to-day of life. No, we prioritize them, we don't worship them. The unduly demanding wife doesn't want to be loved, she wants to be worshiped. And a Christian man will not do this. And Christian wives, by the way, don't require it either. But I would say most men are not in danger of sacrificing too much. We tend to err on the other side of that horse, falling off the other side of the horse. And yet here is the call to masculine initiative. If Jesus was passive, we all go to hell. For us to be saved, Jesus took the initiative, did he not? He incarnated, lived, died, resurrected. That is masculinity. Masculinity takes care of business. And Jesus came to take care of business for sure. Not a passive Jesus, but an active, initiating. This is masculinity. Seize the opportunity. Husbands, take the lead. You know, when women seize the initiative and when women take the lead, they are reenacting what Eve did in the garden. We tend to think about the sin in the garden was Eve when she took the fruit, but the sin before taking the fruit was usurping her husband's headship and the model that God had designed. She turned it upside down. Think of the misery that turning of the headship upside down created and continues to create every time it happens. In fact, we see in the punishment that God sort of fits the crime to the sin. He says to Eve, Eve, you know, you took the lead here. From now on, you're going to desire your husband's headship all the time. And you're going to resent it. You wanted to lead, and from now on, you'll chafe at every time Adam leads. And so ever since the curse, women's temptation has been to dominate their husband, and the husband's temptation is to let them. Henpecked husbands are failures on both the part of the husband and the wife. And so, dear sisters, just a word for you. If you are quietly hoping that your husband is listening to a message about leadership within the home, in order for him to do that, might you have to dial it down a little? Might you have to give him a break and give him a little room to lead, to not be so quick with your opinion that sounds like a mandate? Give him a little space so he can become that. And in becoming that, you might actually find yourself nurturing a more masculine husband, and what a delightful development that would be in your life. Continuing our little theme, M&M, let's talk about a man and his mates. And this is the closest word I could come up with that has an M. I mean that in the friendship sort of way. A man and his mates. Just briefly on this, did you know that men are lonely? The contemporary man is a very lonely man. And we got tons of friends on Facebook, and we can text all these different people and all the rest. And what I think has happened is social media has created this sort of in-between friendship level for men and actual relationships with men, which is something men struggle with anyway. And this has only perpetuated this challenge. I would submit to you men, the struggle with this is in part solved by what it means to be a Christian in the first place. Did you know to be a Christian, you have to admit you're a sinner? You have to admit that you don't have it all together. You got to admit that, man, I blew it, we'll blow it all the time. That's what it means to be a part of a church, is an acknowledgement of that. I've joked before that the church is the only place that you got to admit you're a sinner to get in, and then you try to convince everybody the rest of the time that you're not, okay? And for men, the kind of vulnerability that friendship requires, the basis for that, the gospel itself provides. And so in a church, there ought to be a kind of safety to admit vulnerability and failure that can be the basis of actual male friendships. And tapping into that, I think, is something that maybe our pride doesn't want to do, but in the end could provide us with meaningful friendships with other men that is life-giving to both of us. And men need that, okay? Men need that. This is very important. I'll just note to you, the greatest man who ever lived surrounded himself with 12 other men. Perhaps there's a place to start. And finally, the man and his master, okay? The man and his master. Think with me of the stereotypical men's retreat, okay? Men's retreat. What do men do on a stereotypical men's retreat? We get away and we eat meat, and we throw knives, and we watch UFC, and we compare facial hair. We listen to at least one sermon resembling Braveheart's "They Can't Take Away My Freedom" speech. And I say that because, ironically, the Bible has a lot to say about men and manhood, But it doesn't take us to the steakhouse, and it doesn't take us to the field house or the stadium. It takes us to the cross. There on the cross, we have the ultimate example of male, masculine manhood. And there at that cross, we see the deeply spiritual connection between a man's masculinity and his spirituality. Who we are in our maleness and who we are in Christ. Listen to one quote here, so good. Theology and church and mission are marked by overarching godly male leadership in the spirit of Christ, with an ethos of tender-hearted strength and contrite courage and risk-taking decisiveness and readiness to sacrifice for the sake of leading, protecting, and providing for the community, all of which is possible only through the death and resurrection of Jesus. It's the feel of a great, majestic God who, by his redeeming work in Jesus Christ, inclines men to take humble, Christ-exalting initiative, and inclines women to come alongside the men with joyful support, intelligent helpfulness, and fruitful partnership in the work. That is God's call for genders in the church. And what a beautiful, wonderful thing it is. And when you have a faith community like our church, where the women are let me just backtrack. When you have a faith community picket, a church, and you find women that are doing everything, you will also find there very spiritually effeminate men. That is not God's plan. But when the men are masculine and godly and doing manhood as God called to, and the women are there in their beautiful feminine giftings, these serve together. And the beauty of that together is part of God's design for masculine men and wonderfully feminine women. Like the Garden of Eden. And by the way, like the new earth someday, there we will find all the men to be men indeed.
You're listening to The Journey with Pastor Steve DeWitt, and the conclusion of a lesson titled, What is a Man? To replay the full message, visit thejourney.fm. Well, we're deeply grateful for our faithful listeners and supporters who make the journey possible. Your generosity enables us to share life-changing biblical truth across the nation through radio and digital platforms. Every day, we receive messages from people whose lives have been transformed through these broadcasts. From the busy parent finding wisdom during their morning commute to the lonely soul discovering hope in the middle of the night. As we begin 2025, we're resolved to reach more hearts with God's unchanging truth in our ever-changing world. And your partnership makes these transformations possible. Will you join us in this mission? You can call us at 844-7-JOURNEY. That's 844-756-8763. Or visit thejourney.fm. And as a token of our appreciation for your gift, we'll send you Dr. Julie Slattery's groundbreaking book, Rethinking Sexuality, God's Design and Why It Matters. This isn't just another book about relationships. It's a comprehensive guide to understanding sexuality within God's divine plan. Drawing from biblical wisdom and clinical experience, Dr. Slattery helps us address today's complex sexual challenges with truth and grace. She provides a framework for understanding sexual wholeness and healing, equipping readers to minister effectively to those struggling with brokenness. Filled with practical insights, compelling research, and compassionate guidance, this book becomes an essential resource for navigating these vital issues in your family and community. Let this powerful message guide you to understand and share God's design for sexuality in a deeper way this year. Ask for your copy of Rethinking Sexuality today. Call 844-7-JOURNEY or visit thejourney.fm. And while you're there, if you want to stay connected with all that's happening with The Journey, sign up for our newsletter at the bottom of our homepage. That's all our time for now. I'm Tim Svoboda. Join us tomorrow when Pastor Steve explores what the Bible says about singleness, marriage, and sexuality. Discover how living as citizens of heaven changes everything about how we view relationships today. That's Friday on The Journey. Today's program was produced and furnished by Bethel Church in Crown Point, Indiana.